1974, Langley, Virginia dawn came wrapped in gray and the taste of burned rubber coffee while fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in glass, reminding me I was underground and sealed away from daylight and truth, and I was Thomas E. Caldwell, CA Operations Analyst, Grade 13, Section 4, Directorate of Operations, and my assignment was simple in description and corrosive in effect because I read reports that refuse to make sense, and then I filed them into boxes designed never to be opened again until the morning my supervisor Morrison dropped a battered cardboard box on my desk and told me I had a consolidation project, and his voice carried the fatigue of a man who had learned to live with knowledge he could not unlearn. And he said I was to pull together incident reports that matched a specific behavioral profile across military installations from 1958 to the present, and when I asked what profile, he stared at the box like it might breathe and said non-standard physiological observations and encounters with individuals displaying anomalous characteristics. And when I joked about flying saucers, he lit a cigarette against regulations and corrected me that these were not aircraft and not UFO, but people or things that looked like people. And he told me to read cross-reference and stay silent and not copy anything and never share it outside the vault. And then he left me alone with 40 folders that varied in thickness and age but shared the same buried dread, because every one contained a uniformed witness who saw something impossible, and every one ended with authority sealing the truth shut. And the first file I opened came from a Nevada test and training range in 1958, and it was typed on a manual machine with faded ink and stains and signed by Master Sergeant Alan K. Brooks, a radar technician with 15 years of clean service, and his report stated that during a night shift, he encountered an individual in the underground tunnels who displayed non-regulation behavior and physical anomalies. And he described walking back around 0300 hours and seeing a figure at the far end of the corridor wearing a military uniform that felt wrong under the lights. And when Brooks called out, the figure did not move, and as Brooks approached, he noticed the eyes never blinked, not once during a half-minute stare, and the skin looked tight and waxy, and when the figure spoke, the voice was flat and emotionless, repeating that Brooks was not authorized for the section, and when Brooks insisted, the figure tilted its head and repeated the phrase word for word, and Brooks backed away and ran, and reported immediately, and the tunnels were swept and logs checked, and no one had entered for 6 hours, and Brooks passed medical and psychological evaluation, and the doctor noted genuine distress, and the commander logged the incident and restricted access pending review that never appeared again. And I leaned back trying to dismiss it as stress until I opened the next folder from Thule Air Base, Greenland, 1961, where Lieutenant Colonel James R. Whitman oversaw an inspection of underground storage and encountered a civilian contractor with valid identification whose pupils failed to dilate properly, and who paused mechanically before answering questions, and whose claimed work history contradicted logs, and who vanished from records despite a photograph that looked human until you stared long enough to feel the symmetry was too perfect and the eyes too empty, and that report was stamped and buried. And then Clark Air Base, Philippines, 1963, where a supply officer saw the same individual in 3 locations within 10 minutes, and Diego Garcia, 1968, where a diver surfaced after 20 minutes without hypoxia and showed vitals locked to exact values, as if governed by a thermostat, in Ramstein, Germany, 1970, where an officer with valid access repeated a false explanation with a blank stare and vanished days later along with his records. And as I read file after file, a pattern emerged that left my hands shaking, because every encounter happened at remote or high security installations, and every subject carried credentials that later could not be verified, and every witness was reliable, and every anomaly clustered around eyes, speech movement, and body regulation. And when I built a timeline, I counted at least 60 documented encounters across continents between 1958 and 1974, and the phrase uncanny valley echoed through statements describing the instinctive rejection when something looks human but is not, and yet these beings bled and ate and passed exams, and that contradiction gnawed at me until I sought Dr. Eleonora Finch, a behavioral sciences consultant, and we met in a windowless room, and I laid the files out and she read silently and said professionally the reports could be dissociative perception under stress, but honestly the consistency and the caliber of witnesses meant something happened, and she dismissed foreign operatives and suggested entities physiologically similar but neurologically different able to mimic without unconscious responses, and that word entities settled like frost in my chest. And as I returned to my office, I realized the implications meant something was walking among us with access to our most secure facilities, and someone new. And when I found an additional file labeled Asset L17 from Southeast Asia, describing a French journalist who never ate or slept and left behind a notebook of impossible symbols before disappearing, I knew the scope extended beyond military bases. And when the final note warned "Do not approach," I understood this was not random and that someone had been watching for decades. And as I stared at the box, the fluorescent hum seemed louder, and the sense of being observed grew heavier because the world I thought I understood had cracked open, and what looked back through that crack did not blink. I needed confirmation from someone who had stood where I was standing, so I reached out to Lieutenant Colonel James R. Whitman, whose name appeared in the Greenland file and whose reputation inside the Pentagon marked him as a man who did not imagine things lightly, and arranging that meeting took coded messages and patience until a call came instructing me to arrive alone at a nondescript Arlington address at 1900 hours, and the safe house inside felt heavier than its walls, because Whitman was already there, older than his photograph, with gray at his temples and eyes sharpened by years of discipline, and he wasted no time telling me I had 15 minutes, and I laid out everything I had found: the pattern, the timeline, the 60 encounters, the same wrongness, described in different words across continents and decades. And he listened without interruption until he finally spoke and admitted he had spent 13 years trying to forget what he saw at Thule, telling himself it was exhaustion or Arctic madness, but that he had recognized the contractor again 6 years later at Ramstein, walking across the tarmac in a maintenance uniform. And when Whitman called out, the man looked straight at him with no recognition and disappeared into a hangar, and his name did not exist in rosters, and Whitman filed a report that vanished. And he was advised to take leave and stop asking questions if he valued his career. And he asked me what I would have done in his place, and I had no answer, because fear and ambition weigh differently when the cost is truth. And Whitman admitted he kept the photographs as insurance proof that he was not insane. And when I told him there were 60 cases, his face hardened, because that meant whatever he saw was not isolated. And Whitman shared his theory that these beings were conducting reconnaissance, testing security, mapping installations, learning our procedures over decades. And when I asked reconnaissance for what he said, if he knew he would sleep better, and he gave me names of others who had seen similar things, and mentioned Dr. Finch had helped him process Ramstein, which explained why I had been steered to her. And then he showed me a folder smuggled out of Navy intelligence describing an incident aboard the USS Scorpion months before it was lost in the Atlantic, where a human figure swam in freezing water toward the submarine without protection and vanished after descending to impossible depths. And Whitman refused to speculate, but questioned why the investigation into the Scorpion was sealed for 75 years. And the idea that witnesses were silenced for seeing too much made my stomach turn. And when Whitman left me alone with the files, I returned to Langley, knowing the scope was larger than Talon Vault, and dug deeper, until I found a report from CA Paramilitary Operations in Laos, written by Asset L17, describing a night ambush where a North Vietnamese officer stood calmly under fire, took 3 rounds. Center mass went down and then vanished, leaving only an ozone-like smell, and the phrase post-termination mobility, inconsistent with human physiology, burned into my mind. And cross-referencing Vietnam-era files revealed 6 more cases of enemy soldiers who did not bleed correctly or survived fatal injuries, and whose bodies disappeared before recovery, and patterns sharpened further as certain bases and agencies repeated, including NSADA, and an unfamiliar code Umbra 9, which did not exist in directories, and careful inquiries led nowhere. So I followed budget trails through archives for weeks, until I found a classified line item appearing every year since 1947, labeled Advanced Threat Assessment and Counterintelligence Operations, funded with millions, and tagged Umbra 9, and realization hit that this program spanned every encounter I had read. And then Dr. Finch contacted me me urgently shaken and told me she had reached out to colleagues and been warned off and received a package from a dying mentor containing psychological evaluations of soldiers from the 1950s and 60s, all flagged for persistent false recognition syndrome, where personnel repeatedly encountered people who felt familiar but untraceable and whose records contradicted themselves, and Finch said hundreds, maybe thousands of such cases were buried as stress disorders, and her mentor confessed a program had managed this issue since World War II, monitoring encounters, suppressing reports, relocating witnesses, and containing information rather than exposing it. And when I named Umbra 9, she confirmed its existence and suggested the program might go back even further, because the Nevada report was only the earliest I could access, not the first ever, and she asked what if this was not discovery but management of a known presence, and the thought settled heavily because it meant these entities had lived among us for decades, and someone chose secrecy as policy, and Finch went further, suggesting cooperation, because if the entities meant harm, they had countless opportunities at nuclear and command sites, and yet they only observed, and she showed me a list of Umbra 9 participants still alive, and my blood froze when one name was Morrison, my supervisor, who had given me Talon Vault, and the realization that he had been watching my progress from the start made paranoia feel rational, and Finch suggested he was testing me, evaluating whether I could be trusted, and I drove back to Langley, checking mirrors, knowing my investigation had been observed. And the question was why it was allowed to continue unless Umbra 9 needed new analysts, and that night, surrounded by files, I weighed the choice of staying silent and becoming part of the machine, or risking everything to expose it. And I began making careful copies hidden beyond Morrison reach, and 3 days later, he summoned me and calmly asked for my assessment. And I stated the encounters were genuine, represented an unknown national security factor, and Morrison listened, then handed me a document dated March 1947, titled Memorandum on Non-Human Entities in Military Operations Zones, and as I read about wartime encounters across Allied and Axis theaters, and the directive to establish a permanent program to monitor and suppress disclosure, the truth became undeniable, and Morrison admitted he had been part of Umbra 9 for 18 years, and said they needed new people, and offered me a choice in or out with no middle ground, and I left his office in a haze, knowing sleep would not come, and before dawn I accepted that I could not forget, and that answers lay only inside the program. And when I told Morrison I was in, he nodded and said, "We start today." And the weight of that decision settled deeper than any file I had ever read, because I was no longer just an observer of the truth, but a custodian of it. The weeks that followed blurred into an education that stripped away any remaining illusion I had about the world, because Umbra 9 did not ease you into the truth, and instead submerged you until either you learned to breathe or you drowned. And my days became filled with briefings that rewired how I interpreted reality, and background checks that dissected every decision I had ever made, and psychological evaluations that probed whether I could sit with horror without breaking. And the files they placed before me made Talon Vault feel like a prologue, because these documents reached deeper into time and consequence, and showed that what I had uncovered was not an anomaly, but a thin slice of a far older pattern. In Umbra 9 was not a single office or even a single agency, but a lattice woven through intelligence, military science, and diplomacy, operating in places that did not exist on any map, and staffed by a small coterie of people chosen not for brilliance alone but for restraint and silence. And my role became pattern analysis on a scale that defied intuition, because I was no longer connecting 60 cases but hundreds and then thousands, stretching backward beyond 1947 into wartime Europe and the Pacific, and even earlier fragments that hinted at encounters recorded under different names and classifications. And the central truth repeated itself across decades, that the entities did not interfere, did not sabotage, and did not assist, and instead watched humanity at its most organized and most violent. And the case that defined my understanding came from March 1975, deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, where the heart of the nuclear early warning system pulsed beneath stone and steel. And during a late shift, a technician reported a person in a restricted section, and security challenged credentials and arrived to find no one, and camera footage showed the individual entering from 3 angles and then vanishing without exiting, and frame by frame analysis revealed a distortion around the body, as if reality itself fractured for an instant. And our technical team theorized that the entities could shift between physical states, which explained disappearing bodies and impossible movement, and rendered walls and locks meaningless, and the unsettling part was restraint because they could have accessed anything and yet chose observation. Dr. Finch proposed they studied behavior under pressure like scientists watching an ant colony, and the metaphor chilled the room because it placed us beneath their gaze. And Whitman suggested a theory that unsettled even Morrison, that these beings might be future descendants of humanity studying their own origins, which would explain the resemblance and the uncanny imperfections. And another theory proposed synthetic constructs left behind by a vanished civilization, and each idea raised more questions than answers, and none explained intent. And the program focused on detection methods using thermal imaging to catch temperature anomalies and voice analysis to detect mechanical cadence and facial recognition to flag perfect symmetry and detection improved, but communication remained elusive until August 1975 at Naval Air Station Fallon, when pilots reported glowing shapes moving across restricted desert terrain, and radar captured human-sized contacts at impossible speeds, and ground teams found geometric patterns etched into sand with flawless precision, and linguists confirmed structure and syntax, and Finch suggested the act of drawing was the message and introduction. And Umbra 9 authorized a response, and we returned to the site and laid out mathematical constants and atomic structures, and waited, and nights later, new patterns appeared incorporating and altering our symbols, and the realization that we were conversing with something not human settled like a weight, and one symbol resembling a fractured eye was interpreted as incomplete perception, and another suggested interference, and Finch believed they avoided contamination by hiding and observing, and the exchange continued for months before silence returned, and the encounters elsewhere never ceased. And as I absorbed this knowledge, my sense of self shifted because I understood that humanity was being cataloged at its most complex and dangerous nodes, and the program had chosen secrecy as the only viable containment because disclosure would fracture society, and I saw how witnesses were reassigned, discredited, or quietly retired, not as punishment, but as insulation, and how every decision balanced truth against stability. And I learned that Umbra 9 monitored nuclear sites, submarine bases, and command centers, not to defend them, but to log entity presence and behavior. And the deeper I went, the more I realized that fear was not the core emotion guiding the program, but vigilance and resignation, because after decades of observation, the entities had shown no malice and no empathy, only curiosity and restraint. And I struggled with the moral weight of participating in a system that hid reality from the world, yet I could not deny that uncontrolled exposure would collapse trust and order, and so Umbra 9 continued. And I continued with it, mapping patterns and timelines, and noting that activity spiked during periods of technological leap and geopolitical tension, and diminished during lulls, and the conclusion formed slowly that we were being studied not as individuals but as a species at war with itself. And that realization haunted me because it suggested the entities were not waiting to attack, but to learn and possibly to judge. And when I thought of Master Sergeant Brooks and the others who stood face to face with something that wore a human mask and did not blink, I understood that they were the front line of an invisible observation that spanned generations, and that my role was to make sense of a truth too heavy for daylight, and to carry it forward in silence, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it, and the knowledge becomes a companion that never leaves. Once I was fully inside Umbra 9, the world narrowed and expanded at the same time because my physical surroundings remained the same gray corridors and humming lights. But my understanding of what moved through those spaces changed permanently, and the program unfolded its deeper layers. Controlled exposure because no one was allowed to see everything at once, and my next phase involved immersion into long-term historical synthesis, where I was shown how the encounters did not exist as isolated anomalies, but as a continuous thread woven through modern conflict and power, and my task was to reconstruct that thread without emotion, and that proved harder than any analytical challenge I had faced because the files carried human fear like a residue, and Umbra 9 maintained archives that stretched beyond the official start date into classified wartime collections where the earliest recognizable patterns appeared during the Second World War, and those files were raw and chaotic compared to later documentation because early witnesses had no framework for what they saw, and often described the entities as enemy infiltrators or experimental soldiers, and one report from Occupied France described a German officer who appeared inside a resistance safe house without triggering alarms, and stood silently observing maps before leaving through a wall, and another from the Pacific described a figure on a beachhead who moved through artillery fire, untouched and vanished when approached, and at the time these incidents were dismissed as stress or rumor until repetition forced attention, and the first internal consensus emerged that these were not conventional actors, and that realization hardened into doctrine by the end of the war when encounters continued across opposing forces with no allegiance, and that was when Umbra 9 took form as containment rather than confrontation. And as I traced that evolution, I saw how the program learned restraint from failure, because early attempts at pursuit ended badly with lost teams, vanished bodies, and inexplicable equipment malfunctions, and the lesson became observation only, and documentation only, and never escalation. And that doctrine shaped every decision that followed, including how witnesses were handled, because the goal was not punishment, but insulation to prevent cascading awareness. And one of the most disturbing patterns I identified involved medical anomalies where personnel exposed to close encounters developed subtle neurological effects such as heightened pattern recognition, persistent unease, and recurring dreams of being watched, and Finch explained these as the human mind reacting to broken predictive models, because when the brain cannot categorize a threat, it never resolves the alert state, and the person carries it indefinitely, and that explained why some witnesses never returned to baseline, and why Umbra 9 quietly reassigned them to low exposure roles, and the ethical weight of that practice weighed on me because it treated people as variables rather than lives. But Finch argued the alternative was worse because untreated fixation led to breakdowns and public disclosure, and I saw case after case where containment preserved families and careers at the cost of truth, and the files also revealed moments where the entities tested boundaries, such as appearing repeatedly to the same observer across years, as if tracking individual recognition, and one such case involved a naval officer who encountered the same face at 3 different bases over a decade, and each time the entity acknowledged him with a slight head tilt as if confirming continuity, and that officer eventually requested early retirement, citing stress, and Umbra 9 granted it without question. And I noted how the entities adapted to detection methods over time, correcting earlier anomalies like pupil response and speech cadence as if learning through iteration, and that adaptive behavior confirmed intelligence and intent, and deepened the unease because it meant observation flowed both ways. And during one briefing, Morrison addressed that directly, stating that Umbra 9 assumed awareness was mutual, and that concealment was as much for our protection as theirs, because escalation would draw attention neither side wanted. And when asked why the entities chose military sites, Morrison explained that these locations represented concentrated human capability and decision-making, and that observation there yielded the most data per encounter, and the implication was chilling because it framed war and preparation for war as the defining feature of our species and their analysis. And my synthesis work culminated in a classified assessment that concluded humanity was under passive study by a non-human intelligence whose motives remained unknown, but whose behavior suggested long-term interest rather than immediate threat. And that assessment became foundational doctrine within Umbra 9 and shaped subsequent policy, including the desert communication event, which I later learned was considered a controlled risk because it acknowledged awareness without inviting intrusion. And when that communication ceased, the consensus was that the entities had achieved their objective, which Finch believed was confirmation that we recognized their presence and could respond coherently. And after that point, encounters shifted subtly, becoming briefer and more distant, as if the entities withdrew to avoid altering the subject. And that realization forced me to confront the possibility that Umbra 9 itself was part of the experiment, because our response to the unknown was being measured and documented, and every decision we made was data. And the weight of that possibility followed me through every file and briefing, because it meant there was no neutral ground, only participation. And the longer I remained, the more I understood that secrecy was not simply about control, but about minimizing contamination of the observed system, and that truth was harder to accept than fear because it positioned humanity as something fragile and interesting rather than dominant, and I felt the accumulated pressure of decades settle into a single conclusion that we were not hidden from the universe, and never had been, and that the Quiet Watchers had chosen patience over conquest, and that patience was more unsettling than hostility, because it implied a future we could not see and could not influence, and the knowledge stayed with me as a constant low hum beneath thought, because once you understand you are being watched, the silence becomes louder than any noise. After the desert exchange ended and the sand returned to silence, Umbra 9 shifted from cautious curiosity to something heavier and more introspective, because contact, even indirect, had consequences, and my work changed from synthesis to long-term behavioral projection, which meant studying not only the entities but ourselves under the assumption that observation was continuous and mutual. And this phase exposed the most uncomfortable truth of all, that Umbra 9 had quietly become a mirror held up to humanity, because every choice we made, every cover-up, every reassignment, every suppressed report was itself a data point, and the entities did not need to intervene when human institutions were already documenting their own weaknesses. And one of the first internal debates I witnessed centered on escalation risk, because some within the program argued that the entity's restraint could change if provoked by geopolitical instability, and others believed restraint was inherent, and that intervention would only occur if we crossed some unknown threshold, and Finch argued that thresholds already existed, but were behavioral rather than technological, and that the entities appeared most frequently during periods of fierce secrecy and rapid militarization, which suggested they were studying how we respond to perceived existential threat. And this reframed the Cold War not as a standoff between nations, but as a prolonged stress test observed by something beyond us, and that realization bled into every analysis I produced, because it meant that nuclear brinkmanship, proxy wars, and intelligence paranoia were not just human dramas, but exhibits, and Umbra 9 archives supported this interpretation with encounter density charts that spiked during missile crises, major offensives, and weapons development milestones, and dipped during détente and reconstruction, and the pattern was too consistent to ignore. And what unsettled me most was that the entities never appeared at civilian cultural centers or humanitarian sites with the same frequency, because they were not interested in who we were at rest, but who we were under pressure, and that distinction felt like judgment, even if no judgment had been expressed. And my personal reckoning came when I was assigned to review cases involving repeated individual targeting, where the same witness encountered an entity multiple times across years and locations, and one such case involved an intelligence courier who encountered the same face during 3 separate postings, and reported escalating recognition in the entity eyes, as if confirming the courier remembered, and the final encounter ended with the entity speaking a single unscripted phrase that broke from prior mechanical patterns, and simply said, "You remember," and that line haunted the courier until his retirement, and eventually his death. And Finch believed these cases indicated the entities tracked cognitive continuity and memory persistence in humans, and that individuals who recognized them became markers, and this explained why some witnesses were quietly removed from high-exposure roles, because recognition itself altered the experiment, and that raised ethical alarms, because it meant Umbra 9 was not only containing information, but actively shaping human memory distribution, and the line between protection and manipulation blurred. And Morrison addressed that bluntly in a closed session, stating that the program existed to minimize systemic shock, and that individual discomfort was acceptable collateral to preserve global stability. And I understood his logic, even as it sickened me, because intelligence work trains you to weigh lives abstractly, but this scale was different because it involved reality itself, and my own psychological strain became evident during routine evaluation when I admitted to recurring dreams of corridors in eyes that did not blink. And Finch noted that such dreams were common among analysts deeply immersed in the material, because pattern saturation eroded the sense of coincidence. And once the brain accepted intentional observation, it could not revert, and I was temporarily reassigned to field correlation review, which involved listening to recorded witness interviews rather than reading transcripts, and hearing voices crack as hardened soldiers described the same wrongness, broke through analytical distance, and one interview from a submarine sonar technician described hearing a rhythmic pattern that did not match known marine life, and realizing the sound responded to his own breathing rate, and that detail had been redacted in earlier summaries, but hearing it raw shifted my understanding because it suggested interactive curiosity rather than passive recording, and the question arose whether the entities perceived us individually or collectively, and Umbra 9 leaned toward collective assessment because individual intervention remained minimal, and yet certain individuals were clearly flagged, which meant both scales operated simultaneously, and that duality complicated every model, and my work fed into a projection document assessing future encounter likelihood based on technological trajectory and social stress. And the conclusion was that encounters would increase as humanity approached new thresholds in computation, autonomy, and weaponization. And that conclusion carried policy implications because it suggested secrecy would become harder to maintain, and that Umbra 9 would eventually face a decision between controlled disclosure and uncontrolled revelation, and Morrison admitted privately that the program had contingency plans for partial disclosure, framed as extraterrestrial contact rather than interdimensional observation, because that narrative preserved human agency and avoided confronting the deeper implication that we were being studied like a developing species, and the manipulation inherent in that framing disturbed me because it replaced one lie with another. But Finch argued that narrative containment was necessary because humans needed distance to process existential shifts and raw truth would collapse meaning structures, and I found myself caught between analytical acceptance and moral resistance because while I understood the necessity, I resented being part of a machine that decided how much reality people deserved, and the tension peaked when a new case arrived from a missile control facility where an officer reported an entity observing launch protocols from behind blast glass and reacting not to the weapons but to the human decision-making chain, and Finch interpreted that as interest in authority, delegation, and moral distance in lethal systems, and that interpretation reframed nuclear deterrence as a sociological artifact rather than a technological one, and left the room silent because it implied that our most terrifying weapons were less interesting than how we justified their existence, and my internal conflict deepened as I realized that Umbra 9 could never truly resolve the mystery because resolution would require direct engagement, and direct engagement risked altering the very behavior being studied, and so the program existed in permanent tension between knowing and not knowing, and that tension mirrored the human condition itself. And in quieter moments I thought of Morrison handing me Talon Vault, and wondered whether he had once struggled with the same questions and simply learned to compartmentalize them, and the truth I arrived at was uncomfortable because I recognized that I had begun to do the same, and that realization frightened me more than the entities ever had because it meant adaptation was already occurring, and the line between observer and subject was thinner than we admitted. And in my internal report, I wrote a sentence that would never be seen outside Umbra 9, stating that the greatest risk was not invasion or eradication, but normalization, and that once humanity accepted being watched, the watchers would no longer need to hide, and that thought lingered like a shadow at the edge of awareness, because it suggested the future would not arrive with fire or revelation, but with quiet acceptance, and that was the most terrifying outcome of all. The longer I remained inside Umbra 9, the more I understood that the program was not static but adaptive, because it had learned to evolve in response to both human behavior and entity behavior, and that evolution carried a cost measured not in budgets or politics, but in erosion of certainty. By the time I entered my second year, the question was no longer whether the entities existed, but whether humanity could continue pretending that observation had no psychological gravity. And my assignment shifted again, this time into risk forecasting, which meant projecting not enemy action, but human reaction to eventual awareness, and that task forced me to study how societies collapse or adapt when foundational beliefs are disrupted, and history offered parallels in religion, science, and war, but none mapped cleanly, because this was not a revelation that elevated humanity or united it, but one that reduced it to a subject, and the files I reviewed showed how even partial leaks had destabilizing effects, because whenever rumors surfaced about beings walking among us, paranoia spiked, mistrust flourished, and violence followed, and Umbra 9 had cataloged these micro-outbreaks, carefully noting that humans responded more aggressively to threats that mimicked them than to distant, abstract enemies, and Finch explained this as an identity violation because something that looks human but is not disrupts social heuristics and triggers defensive aggression, and that insight explained why controlled narratives favored distant aliens rather than perfect mimics, and why shapeshifter myths persisted across cultures as cautionary tales, and my forecasting models predicted that open acknowledgement of the entity's true nature would fracture social cohesion faster than any external invasion. And Morrison accepted those projections without visible reaction because he had lived with that knowledge longer than I had, and he reminded me that Umbra 9 existed not to save humanity, but to buy it time, and that phrase "buy time" echoed through my thoughts because it implied an expiration we could not see, and the more data we collected, the clearer it became that the entities themselves operated on temporal scales far longer than human planning horizons, and that asymmetry shaped every interaction because patience favored them and urgency plagued us, and the most sobering realization emerged from longitudinal analysis showing that entity encounters rarely resulted in immediate harm, but often preceded institutional stress such as leadership, turnover, policy shifts, or military escalation, as if the entities appeared during moments of inflection and observed decision, outcomes, and Finch suggested they might be sampling responses rather than causing events, which meant our own choices generated the data they sought, and that placed responsibility back on us rather than them, and my own internal stress reached a peak when I was asked to review a case involving civilian proximity. Because until then, Umbra 9 had successfully limited exposure to military and intelligence personnel, but in this instance an entity appeared in a civilian research hospital adjacent to a defense contractor and interacted briefly with a nurse who later reported a profound sense of being assessed rather than threatened, and that nurse developed heightened anxiety and persistent dissociation, and Umbra 9 intervened with relocation and counseling and suppression of the incident. But the case forced acknowledgement that boundaries were porous, and that as military research intertwined with civilian infrastructure, exposure would increase, and my report warned that the wall between protected and unprotected populations was thinning, and that the program would face ethical scrutiny even if hidden, and Morrison acknowledged the risk, but noted that Umbra 9 lacked authority to reshape national infrastructure and could only respond reactively, and that limitation frustrated me because it meant we were always behind the curve and reacting to aftershocks rather than preventing exposure, and my frustration deepened when I learned that some within the program advocated limited collaboration with the entities to establish boundaries and protocols, but those proposals stalled because no reliable method of direct communication existed, and because any attempt risked signaling vulnerability or intent, and the Desert Exchange remained the only successful contact, and its cessation left us without a channel, and in absence of communication, speculation filled the void and theories hardened into camps, with some believing the entities were benign archivists and others fearing eventual intervention once data collection concluded, and the inability to resolve that uncertainty weighed on morale because working indefinitely without an end state eroded purpose, and I observed colleagues burn out, withdraw, or become overly rigid, and Finch warned that psychological attrition was the greatest internal threat to Umbra 9 because analysts who lost flexibility either dismissed anomalies prematurely or saw patterns everywhere, and both errors compromised assessment. And to mitigate that risk, the program instituted rotation and enforced downtime. But even away from work, the knowledge followed us, because once you understand that human institutions are permeable, sense of safety never fully returns, and my own coping mechanism became routine and compartmentalization. And I realized with unease that I was adopting the same strategies used to contain witnesses, and that normalization had reached me as well. And one night, after reviewing a cluster of encounters at a strategic air command base, I found myself watching strangers in a restaurant, cataloging eye movement, speech cadence, posture. And the moment I recognized that behavior, I felt a surge of self-loathing, because I had internalized the gaze of the observer and become a smaller version of what I studied. And Finch later confirmed this phenomenon as observer inversion, where prolonged exposure leads analysts to mirror the perceived perspective of the entities, and she cautioned that unchecked it could lead to detachment and dehumanization, and that warning forced me to confront the personal cost of continuing, and yet leaving the program would not restore innocence because the knowledge could not be erased, and the choice became one of burden placement rather than escape. And that realization aligned with Morrison's own philosophy, which he shared during a rare moment of candor when he said, "The hardest part was accepting that no one would ever thank us, and that history would not remember Umbra 9, because if it did we would have failed, and that anonymity extended even to self-perception, because we could not see ourselves as heroes without distorting judgment, and so we learned to operate without validation and without closure, and that environment bred a quiet fatalism that I felt settling into my bones, and my assessment concluded with a projection that humanity would reach a threshold where secrecy would fracture not because of leaks, but because of scale as encounters increased. Alongside surveillance, technology, and civilian recording, and that Umbra 9 would eventually face a decision between adaptation and obsolescence, and the weight of that future pressed on me because it suggested my role was transitional, a bridge between ignorance and something undefined, and entities remained silent through all of this, neither confirming nor denying our fears. And that silence was its own pressure, because it forced us to confront ourselves rather than an external enemy. And in that confrontation, I saw the fragility of human narratives and the ease with which meaning could be destabilized, and I understood that Umbra 9's ultimate function was not to solve the mystery, but to slow its impact, and that realization brought a strange calm, because it clarified purpose even as it erased hope of resolution. And I carried that calm into my work, accepting that uncertainty was not a flaw but a condition, and that living under observation was not new but simply revealed, and that knowledge settled into me like a second heartbeat, steady and unavoidable, marking the passage of time, until whatever came next arrived quietly, as all the others had. Time has a way of compressing when you live inside secrets, because days lose their edges and years feel like a single long night. And by the time I understood that Umbra 9 was not an operation with an end, but a condition that would persist beyond any individual, the weight of that knowledge had settled into permanence, and I stopped expecting closure and began measuring success by absence, meaning no panic, no exposure, no collapse, and that metric defined our victories even as it erased any sense of triumph. And the encounters continued at a steady rhythm, neither increasing nor vanishing, and each report carried the same quiet wrongness and the same disciplined restraint from the entities, as if they had completed a phase of observation and shifted into maintenance, and my role narrowed again into custodianship, because pattern analysis eventually yields diminishing returns once the pattern stabilizes, and what remained was vigilance and continuity, and ensuring that knowledge passed cleanly from one generation of analysts to the next without distortion or leakage. And Morrison prepared me for that responsibility during a late-night conversation in his office, where the lights hummed and the windows showed only reflected interiors, and he said the program survived because people learned when to stop asking certain questions and start protecting others from them. And I asked him if he ever regretted joining, and he paused longer than usual before answering that regret implied an alternative he could have lived with, and that he had never seen one, and that answer haunted me because it stripped away the illusion that there was a cleaner path. And as years passed, I watched colleagues retire quietly, carrying fragments of the truth into obscurity, and watched new analysts arrive with the same initial disbelief, and I recognized myself in them and guided them gently, because shock unmanaged becomes denial, and denial breeds mistakes. And the entities remained silent observers throughout these transitions, appearing at bases, facilities, and command centers with the same neutral curiosity and the same unsettling precision, and never once did they acknowledge Umbra 9 directly beyond the desert exchange, which remained the only hint of reciprocity, and Finch maintained that this restraint indicated intent to minimize contamination, and that they preferred to let humanity reach conclusions organically, and that perspective shifted my understanding of free will, because observation alone alters behavior, and yet we continued making choices, believing them our own, and perhaps that belief was the only freedom that mattered. And my final synthesis report for internal archives argued that Umbra 9 itself had become part of the human adaptive response, and that secrecy functioned as a psychological buffer, allowing society to evolve without confronting existential reduction prematurely. And that report was archived without comment, because within the program consensus rarely needed affirmation, and my personal reckoning came unexpectedly during a routine review of the earliest Nevada file, when I realized that Master Sergeant Brooks had stood at the threshold of the entire modern archive, and that his simple act of reporting rather than dismissing his experience had rippled forward into decades of documentation and containment, and I wondered how many others before him had chosen silence and how different history might look if truth accumulation had followed another path, and that thought sharpened my awareness of contingency, because the world we inhabit is built not only on events but on decisions to record or forget, and Umbra 9 existed in the space between those choices, and as my tenure lengthened, I accepted that I would never know the entity's origin or ultimate purpose, and that perhaps they themselves did not frame it in terms humans would recognize. And Finch once suggested that intelligence does not guarantee narrative, and that meaning might be an emergent property rather than an objective, and that idea reframed my anxiety because it removed the expectation of revelation and allowed acceptance of ambiguity, and the program continued to adapt. Technology advanced with new detection challenges and new risks as civilian surveillance proliferated, and the internet blurred boundaries between classified and speculative, and Umbra 9 responded by refining misinformation strategies not to deceive maliciously, but to diffuse focus and preserve uncertainty, and that strategy succeeded because humans gravitate towards spectacle and simple explanations, and the true nature of the entities resisted both and remained hidden in plain sight. And my own life outside the program narrowed as relationships strained under unspoken distance, and I learned to speak around my experiences rather than about them, and that isolation was a common cost among those of us who carried the secret, and Finch addressed it directly during a group session, reminding us that meaning could be found in stewardship rather than disclosure, and that protecting psychological integrity of billions outweighed personal expression, and I accepted that framing because it offered purpose without requiring validation. And as I aged within the program, I became a mentor rather than an analyst, and watched others take up the work with the same quiet resolve, and I saw in them the future of Umbra 9, and understood that continuity mattered more than innovation, and the entities remained a constant background presence, never escalating, never withdrawing, and I sometimes wondered if they noticed the generational turnover among those who watched them, or if to them were interchangeable instances of a species pattern, and that thought no longer frightened me because fear requires a sense of impending loss, and I had already surrendered the illusion of centrality, and what remained was awareness and duty, and a strange calm that came from alignment with reality rather than resistance to it. And when I look back now, I see my life divided not by before and after joining Umbra 9, but by before and after accepting that humanity is not alone and never has been, and that observation does not diminish us unless we allow it to, and that understanding has shaped how I move through the world quietly, attentively, and without expectation of recognition. And sometimes when I pass a military installation or a government building and feel that familiar sense of being watched, I no longer tense, because I know the watchers are not monsters or saviors, but something other and patient, and that patience has outlasted wars, empires, and ideologies, and will likely outlast Umbra 9 itself. And the files of Project Talon Vault remain secured and growing, carrying evidence of encounters that never made the news, and truths buried under layers of classification and denial. And if you have reached this point, you now know more than nearly everyone else alive, and that knowledge carries responsibility whether acknowledged or not, because awareness changes perception, and perception shapes behavior. And the next time you feel that instinctive wrongness when someone does not blink or moves just slightly out of rhythm, do not dismiss it, because your brain evolved to detect patterns that conscious thought cannot articulate, and sometimes those patterns point to something wearing a human face that should not be wearing one, and the entities are real, and encounters happened, and they are still happening, and the world is not what you think it is, and it never was. And Umbra 9 continues quietly buying time and managing truth, and carrying a burden few will ever understand. And this is where my account ends, not because the story is finished, but because some stories do not conclude, they simply persist. And if there is one lesson in all of this, it is that you are never truly alone and never truly unseen, and that realization is not meant to terrify, but to remind you that awareness itself is a form of connection, and whether watched or watching, we are all part of something larger unfolding beyond our comprehension, and that is the final truth I can give you, and it must be enough. This file is now closed, but the watch continues, and what you have read is only one layer of a much deeper record that never stops growing. And if this account stayed with you, if it unsettled you or made you question what moves unseen around you, then remember that awareness is the first step Understanding, and there are more files like this, more programs, more encounters buried behind classification and silence. And if you want those files opened, if you want the next record brought into the light, then stay here, stay curious, and stay alert, because the truth does not announce itself. It waits to be noticed, and the next file is already waiting to be read.